You have 72 hours to vacate the premises, or we will have the sheriff remove you. My mother-in-law placed the eviction notice on the kitchen table right next to the casserole someone from church had dropped off that morning. My husband had been dead for 6 days. The flowers on the counter hadn't even wilted yet, and she was already changing the locks. She didn't hand me the paper. She placed it flat, smoothing the creases with her palm like she was presenting a contract at a board meeting. Her nails were fresh. She'd gotten a manicure sometime between the funeral and this moment. I noticed because my own hands were raw from scrubbing the bathroom tiles at 2 in the morning, the only thing I could do when the grief hit so hard I couldn't breathe. Before I tell you what I found hidden inside my husband's old toolbox in the garage that turned his entire family upside down, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from right now and what time it is. I want to see how far this story reaches. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I picked up the eviction notice, folded it once, and slid it into the pocket of the oversized flannel shirt I'd been wearing for 3 days straight. It was his shirt. It still smelled like sawdust and the sandalwood cologne he wore every Sunday. My mother-in-law, Diane, thought she was dealing with a broken widow who had spent the last 2 years watching her son waste away from pancreatic cancer. She saw a girl who dropped out of the workforce to become a full-time nurse, someone with no income, no assets, and no fight left. She forgot, or maybe she never bothered to learn, that before I married her son, I was Mara, a 31-year-old forensic accountant who had spent 7 years at one of the top litigation support firms in Chicago. I'd traced embezzlement schemes through 14 shell corporations. I'd been deposed as an expert witness in federal court 9 times before I turned 28. I didn't just follow money, I hunted it. Diane thought she was smart because she ran a chain of medical supply stores across 3 states. She thought business acumen was the same thing as financial literacy. It's not. Business people make money. People like me find out where they hide it. I sat down at the kitchen table after she left and opened my laptop. The house was quiet in that horrible way only a home where someone has recently died can be quiet. Not peaceful. Vacant. Like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I logged into the county recorder's office and pulled the deed. My husband and I had bought this house together 4 years ago. Both names on the title. Community Property State. I knew my rights, but the document that loaded on my screen made my stomach drop. The deed had been modified 9 months ago, while my husband was on his 3rd round of chemo and I was managing his IV medications at home. Someone had filed a quitclaim deed, transferring his 50% ownership to the Whitfield Family Trust, a trust controlled entirely by Diane. My husband's signature was on it. I stared at the screen. I knew his handwriting better than I knew my own. The signature was close, very close, but the tail on the Y was wrong. He always looped it to the left, a habit from being left-handed. This one curved right. Someone had forged my husband's signature while he was dying. I didn't panic. Panic is what amateurs do. I screenshotted everything, saved it to 3 separate cloud drives, and started mapping the timeline. If Diane had gone through the trouble of forging a quitclaim deed, she wasn't just trying to take a house. She was trying to erase me from the estate entirely. And if she was that desperate, there was more to find. I needed access to the trust documents. The problem was, Diane's attorney had sent a cease and desist letter to our family lawyer 2 days after the funeral, claiming I had no legal standing to view trust records. Our lawyer, a kind man named Gerald, who had drafted our wills, said he was sorry, but his hands were tied without a court order. So I went looking for what I could access. Bank statements. My husband and I had a joint checking account. I logged in. The balance was $41.16. 3 weeks ago, it had held $63,000, the last of our savings after I'd drained everything to cover what insurance wouldn't pay. I scrolled through the transactions. 12 transfers over 9 days, all sent to an account I didn't recognize at a bank in Delaware. Each one just under $5,000, structured specifically to avoid triggering a currency transaction report. That's called structuring. It's a federal crime. And it told me something important. Whoever moved this money knew enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be invisible. I copied every transaction, time-stamped it, and started building my case in a spreadsheet. Not for a lawyer. Not yet. For me. Because I knew that the moment I walked into a courtroom, I needed to know more about Diane's finances than she did. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in our bed, in his shirt, staring at the ceiling. The house made sounds it never used to make. Or maybe it always did. And his breathing had drowned them out. I kept reaching for his side of the bed and finding cold sheets. At 3 in the morning, I got up and went to the garage. I don't know what pulled me there. Maybe it was the smell motor oil and cedar. the scent of every Saturday afternoon he'd spent out here building furniture for neighbors who couldn't afford to buy it. His workbench was untouched. Diane's people hadn't gotten to the garage yet. I sat on his stool and let myself cry for the first time in days. Not the polite crying I'd done at the funeral, the ugly kind. The kind where your whole body shakes and you can't tell if you're breathing in or out. When I finally stopped, I noticed his toolbox, the old red one with the dented corner that he'd had since trade school. Something was different about it. The combination lock was set to a number I didn't recognize. Our anniversary was 0714. This read 0331. March 31st, my birthday. I opened it. Inside, beneath a layer of socket wrenches and a voltage tester, was a manila envelope sealed with packing tape. On the front, in his handwriting, real handwriting this time, shaky but unmistakably his, were 2 words. For Mara. My hands were trembling so badly I had to use a box cutter to open it. Inside were 3 things: a USB flash drive, a handwritten letter, and a certified copy of a new will dated 4 months before he died. The letter was short. His handwriting had deteriorated, the letters sliding downhill across the unlined paper. Mara, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and my mother is doing what I always feared she would. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stop her while I was alive. The flash drive has everything: bank records, emails, recordings. She's been stealing from her own stores for years, running profits through a second set of books. The trust she made me sign isn't valid. I was on 70 milligrams of oxycodone when she put that paper in front of me. I didn't know what I was signing. The new will leaves everything to you. I had it notarized at the hospital when Mom thought I was in radiology. I love you. I'm sorry this is the only way I could protect you. Fight for us. I sat on the garage floor for a long time after that. The concrete was cold through my jeans. I held the letter against my chest and breathed. Then I plugged in the flash drive. What I found was meticulous. My husband might not have been a forensic accountant, but he was an engineer, and engineers document everything. He had screenshots of QuickBooks files showing 2 separate ledgers for 3 of Diane's stores. He had recorded phone conversations legal in our one-party consent state where Diane discussed routing cash payments through a personal account to avoid sales tax obligations. He had bank statements showing deposits into a Cayman Islands account that didn't appear on any corporate filing. My dying husband had spent his last months, between chemo sessions and morphine doses, building the case I would need to survive. The next morning, Diane showed up with a moving crew. 3 men in a white van, ready to pack my life into boxes. She stood in the doorway in a cream-colored coat, sipping from a travel mug like she was supervising a renovation, not an eviction. I've arranged storage for your personal items, she said, not looking at me. Anything that belonged to my son stays. Everything in this house belonged to both of us, I said. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were the same shade of blue as his, but where his had been warm, hers were like looking into a freezer. Sweetheart, you were a caretaker. You kept him comfortable while he was dying. That's not the same as being family. She said it so casually, like she was correcting a misunderstanding about a restaurant reservation. I was his wife. You were a convenience. She set down her mug and straightened a picture frame on the hallway table, a photo of her son at age 12, before I existed in his world. Now, the movers are going to start in the master bedroom. I assume you've washed the linens? I watched her walk through the house, pointing at things. That painting goes in my car. Box up the books. The dining set is cherry wood. Be careful with it. She stopped at the mantel. His urn was there. Simple, matte black, with a small engraved compass on the front because he always said he wanted to keep heading north. That, she said to the foreman, goes in the van. That stays, I said from behind her. She turned slowly. Excuse me? His ashes stay with me. She laughed. Not a real laugh. The performative kind meant to make you feel small. You want to keep him on a shelf in whatever studio apartment you end up in? That's morbid. He belongs in the family mausoleum. I've already arranged the transfer. He belongs with his wife. He belongs with his mother. She reached for the urn. I carried him for 9 months. You had him for 4 years. Do the math. She picked it up. I watched her hand close around the urn that held the only physical thing I had left of the man who had written me a letter from his deathbed because he was afraid his own mother would destroy me. She handed it to the foreman. Wrap it. It's going in my car. I didn't stop her. Not because I couldn't, but because in that moment, watching her reduce him to a custody dispute measured in years, I understood something with absolute clarity. This woman didn't love her son. She owned him. Alive or dead, he was inventory. And I was done negotiating with someone who saw people as line items. I walked to the garage, collected the toolbox, the flash drive, the letter, and the will. I put them in my car. Diane didn't even notice. She was too busy arguing with the foreman about whether the oriental rug should be rolled or folded. The probate hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday at the county courthouse downtown. I arrived 40 minutes early because I needed to go over my notes one final time. I was wearing the only professional outfit I still owned, a charcoal blazer I'd bought when I was still working, paired with black flats because I'd sold my heels months ago to cover a pharmacy bill. I was crossing the plaza toward the courthouse steps when I heard it. A sharp crack, then a yelp. An elderly man's wheelchair had caught on a broken section of sidewalk where a tree root had pushed the concrete into a jagged ridge. The front wheel had snapped clean off, and he was tilted forward at an angle that would have dumped him onto the pavement if he hadn't grabbed the armrest of a nearby bench. People streamed past him. A woman in a business suit glanced down, then checked her watch and kept walking. A man on his phone stepped wide around the wheelchair like it was a puddle. I checked my own watch. I had 35 minutes. If I stopped, I'd have to recalculate my prep time. If I got his chair out of the crack, I might scuff up the only presentable blazer I had left. But I looked at his face. He was embarrassed. Not the kind of embarrassment that comes from tripping in public. The deeper kind. The kind that comes from realizing the world has decided you're not worth 30 seconds of inconvenience. I thought about Diane handing the urn to a stranger. I walked over. "Don't move. I've got you." He looked up. He had a weathered face and sharp gray eyes that tracked me with an alertness that didn't match his situation. "Miss, you'll ruin your jacket. Jackets are replaceable," I said, crouching down to examine the wheel. "People aren't." The axle pin had sheared off. I couldn't reattach it. Instead, I flagged down a courthouse security guard who brought a folding wheelchair from the Disability Services office. I helped the old man transfer into the new chair, picking up the briefcase that had fallen into the gutter, wiping it off with my sleeve. "Thank you," he said. He studied me for a moment. "You're heading inside?" "Probate hearing," I said. "My mother-in-law is trying to take everything my husband left me." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "Which courtroom?" "14B, Judge Morrison." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition, or maybe just interest. "My name is Arthur," he said. "I'm a retired judge. I sat on the appellate bench in this district for 22 years. I know every attorney who practices in this building, and I know how the game is played." He leaned forward. "I don't know your situation, but I know what a person looks like when they're walking into a fight they've been told they can't win. You stopped for me when no one else did. Let me sit in that courtroom. If nothing else, you'll have a witness. And in my experience, lawyers behave very differently when they know someone is watching." I looked at this man. Mud on his wheels, a borrowed wheelchair, and a briefcase that probably cost more than my car. Something about his calm certainty reminded me of my husband in his final weeks, when he'd stopped being afraid and just started being precise. "Okay," I said. "Let's go." Courtroom 14B was a wood-paneled room that smelled like old paper and floor wax. Diane was already seated at the respondent's table with her attorney, a man named Garrison Holt, who was known around the courthouse for winning custody battles through attrition, burying the other side in motions until they ran out of money. Diane looked immaculate. Cream suit, pearl earrings, not a hair out of place. She looked like a woman who had already decided how this would end. When I walked in, she saw the charcoal blazer, the flat shoes, the file folder under my arm. She almost smiled. Then she saw Arthur, rolling in behind me, his briefcase across his lap. "What is this?" Garrison said, standing. "This is a closed probate proceeding." "It's not closed. It's public record," I said. "He's an observer." Garrison looked at Arthur. Arthur looked back with the serene patience of a man who had spent 2 decades watching lawyers try to bluff their way through proceedings. Garrison sat down. Diane leaned toward her attorney. "Who is the old man? She picked up some homeless person off the street?" "I don't know," Garrison muttered. "Ignore him." The hearing began. Garrison presented the quitclaim deed, the trust documents, and a sworn affidavit from Diane stating that her son had voluntarily transferred his property interest 9 months prior to his death as part of a family estate plan. I stood when it was my turn. My hands were steady. "Your Honor, I'd like to present 3 items into evidence." I submitted the new will first. Garrison objected, calling it unverified. I produced the notarization certificate signed by 2 hospital employees and the attending nurse. Judge Morrison accepted it into evidence. Then I submitted the quitclaim deed with my analysis. If the court compares the signature on this deed with verified samples of my husband's handwriting, you'll note a consistent discrepancy in the formation of lowercase letters. My husband was left-handed. The person who signed this document was not. Garrison's face changed. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the jaw. Additionally, I continued, the deed was filed on March 3rd of last year. Hospital records show my husband was admitted for emergency surgery on March 2nd and remained under sedation until March 5th. He could not have signed this document on the date indicated. The courtroom was quiet. Then I submitted the flash drive. Your Honor, this drive contains financial records compiled by my husband during the last 4 months of his life. It includes evidence that the respondent has been operating a dual ledger accounting system across 3 of her business locations, routing unreported cash income through a personal account to evade state and federal tax obligations. It also contains recorded conversations in which the respondent discusses these arrangements in detail. Diane stood up. That's a lie. Those are private business records. He had no right, Mrs. Whitfield, Judge Morrison said. Sit down. Garrison grabbed Diane's arm. She shook him off. This is a shakedown. She's a gold digger who married my son for his inheritance, and now she's fabricating. Diane. Garrison's voice was sharp. Stop talking. But Diane couldn't stop. That was her weakness. She had spent 62 years being the smartest person in the room, and she couldn't conceive of a scenario where silence was the better strategy. I took care of everything, she snapped. I paid for the best oncologists. I covered the experimental treatments insurance wouldn't touch. You think any of that was free? I spent over $200,000 keeping him alive. And what did she do? She pointed at me. She sat in his house and played nurse. Your Honor, I said, I'd like the record to reflect that the respondent just confirmed spending $200,000 on her son's medical care. The trust's financial disclosures filed with this court show 0 medical expenditures. If those funds came from the trust, they were unreported. If they came from her personal accounts, I'd like to understand why she simultaneously claimed a $200,000 medical deduction on the trust's tax return. Garrison closed his eyes. Arthur, sitting in the back row, hadn't moved. But I noticed that he'd been writing. Not casual notes, detailed, methodical entries in a leather-bound notebook. When Garrison glanced back at him, Arthur met his gaze with the kind of look that said, I know exactly what you've been doing, and now I have it in writing. Garrison turned back to the judge. Your Honor, my client would like to request a recess to consult with counsel. Denied, Judge Morrison said. We're going to finish this today. What happened next took 11 minutes. Diane's entire case unraveled like a cheap sweater caught on a nail. The forged deed was struck. The will I'd found in the toolbox was validated and entered as the governing document. The trust was frozen pending a forensic audit, one that the court appointed based on the evidence from the flash drive. And then Garrison did something I didn't expect. He stood, straightened his tie, and said, Your Honor, I'd like to note for the record that I was retained by Mrs. Whitfield 3 weeks ago and was not made aware of the documents or financial arrangements now in evidence. I'm withdrawing as counsel. He picked up his briefcase and walked out without looking at Diane. She sat there. For the first time since I'd known her, she was completely still. No fidgeting, no commands, no performance. She looked small in that cream suit. She looked like someone who had just realized that the empire she'd built was constructed on a foundation she had personally drilled holes through. Mrs. Whitfield, Judge Morrison said, based on the evidence presented today, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order preventing you from accessing, transferring, or disposing of any assets connected to the Whitfield Family Trust or the estate of the deceased. Additionally, I'm referring the financial records submitted today to the district attorney's office for review. Diane's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I turned and looked at Arthur. He closed his notebook and gave me a single nod. Outside the courthouse, in the pale afternoon light, Arthur handed me a business card. It read, Arthur Brennan, Senior Judge, Retired, 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. You didn't need me in there, he said. You had everything you needed. Having you there changed the temperature in the room, I said. Garrison recognized you, didn't he? Garrison clerked for me in 1994, Arthur said. He's not a bad lawyer, but he has a habit of not asking his clients the right questions. Today, he got a reminder of why those questions matter. I thanked him. He waved it off. You stopped when no one else did. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. He paused. Your husband chose well. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I could drive. I held his letter against the steering wheel and read it one more time. The part that broke me wasn't the evidence or the instructions. It was the last line, "Fight for us." 3 weeks later, the district attorney opened a formal investigation into Diane's businesses. The dual ledger system my husband had documented led to the discovery of over $1.2 million in unreported income across 6 years. Her accounts were seized. The quitclaim deed was formally voided, and the house was returned to me as the sole surviving beneficiary under the validated will. I got the urn back. Diane had put it in a storage unit with the furniture she'd taken. It was buried under a stack of decorative throw pillows, shoved in the back corner like an afterthought. I brought him home. I set him on the mantel, right where he belonged, next to the photo of us at the courthouse the day we got married. Him in his work boots because he'd come straight from a job site. Me in a yellow sundress because I'd read somewhere that brides didn't always have to wear white. The house is quiet now, but it's a different kind of quiet. Not the vacant silence of someone missing, the settled stillness of someone who's been found. I sat in his chair in the garage last night. The red toolbox was back on the workbench, right where he always kept it. The combination is still set to my birthday. I don't have an empire. I don't have offshore accounts. I don't have a mother-in-law who calls anymore. But I have the house. I have the truth. And I have a letter from a man who spent his last days on Earth making sure I'd be okay, hidden inside a toolbox he knew I'd eventually find, because he knew me better than anyone, and he knew I'd fight. Not for the money, not for the house, for us.